Hey guys, tonight we're going on a journey not to a place of grand palaces or sun-drenched ruins, but to the shadows, to the dim, fog-choked alleyways of the Victorian era, specifically the ones stretching across the vast colonial empires. You're walking on cobbled streets slick with a perpetual mist, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and something sweet, sickly, and utterly intoxicating. It's the kind of scent that promises an escape, a quiet oblivion, but always delivers a harsher reality. This isn't a stroll you'd want to take alone, especially after dark. The street lamps, when they exist, cast weak, jaundiced circles on the ground, barely illuminating the figures hunched in doorways. You clutch your jacket tighter, the fabric feeling thin against the damp chill, and you try not to make eye contact with the gaunt, skeletal shapes slumped against brick walls. They're everywhere, a silent testament to a trade that built empires and destroyed lives. You probably won't survive this walk in the historical record, but at least in our little armchair adventure, you get to stay warm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. It's always wild to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the docks of a colonial port city, perhaps Calcutta or Hong Kong. The year is sometime in the mid-1800s. The air is alive with the cacophony of commerce, the shouts of stevedores, the creak of timber, the distant whistles of steamships. But beneath it all, there's a quieter, more pervasive sound, the rustle of paper money and the clinking of coins, fueling a trade that's anything but straightforward. You see the ships arriving, their holds brimming with goods, but you're looking for one specific cargo. It's not tea or silk, though those are here too. No, you're watching for the crates stamped with the crests of British trading houses, their contents carefully wrapped and sealed. Inside, nestled amongst layers of sacking and straw, are bricks of a dark, resinous paste, opium. This isn't just a substance, it's the very foundation of an economic system. For every bolt of cloth or handful of silver that leaves Britain, a corresponding amount of opium is shipped out to Asia, particularly to the vast and ancient land of China. It's a three-cornered trade, a perfect, wicked triangle. The British want Chinese tea and silk, but China doesn't want much of what Britain produces. Historians still argue whether the British government's complicity was a deliberate act of mass addiction or reluctant embrace of a profitable, albeit problematic, market. It seems to have been both. You see the crates being unloaded, and you wonder how many lives are already tied up in these simple wooden boxes. This trade, at its core, was about balancing the books. Britain was buying more from China than it was selling. A classic trade deficit. So, the East India Company, that massive, quasi-governmental trading powerhouse, found its solution in a narcotic. It was an ingenious, if morally bankrupt, plan. Get a massive population addicted to something you can produce cheaply in your colonies, and then use the profits to buy the luxury goods they produce. It's a vicious, self-sustaining loop, and as you watch the porters strain under the weight of the crates, a chilling thought settles in. This isn't just about economics anymore. It's about power. It's about subjugation, and you can smell the sweet, cloying scent of it all, mingling with the salt spray and the sweat of men who are simply trying to make a living, completely unaware they're cogs in a machine of global addiction. You spot a sailor with a crudely tattooed anchor on his forearm, and you hear him mutter something about black tears, a common term for the substance that makes men weep with relief and then later, with despair. You watch the ships come in, the holds of the vessels from India and the Middle East overflowing with the raw materials, poppy pods, and then the sticky, dark bricks of what they call the drug of dreams. It's a surreal sight, this silent, methodical transfer of a substance that will upend entire societies. The economics of it are almost laughably simple. If you forget the human cost for a moment, British merchants would buy opium grown in British India for next to nothing. This opium was then shipped to China, where it was sold for a massive profit. The money they made, the silver dollars and sices, was then used to purchase Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain, which were then shipped back to Britain and sold for another hefty profit. It's a perfect, self-contained system of exploitation. You can almost see the gears turning. The invisible lines of currency and cargo connecting London, Calcutta, and Canton in a web of pure, unadulterated capitalism. It feels like a historical version of a Ponzi scheme, but one built on a literal, physical product that destroys the user. One of the quirky little details of this period is just how ubiquitous the trade became. Historians still argue whether the Qing government's attempts to outlaw the trade were genuinely about public health or were a desperate attempt to stop the massive outflow of silver from their economy. It was both, of course. But the economic factor was arguably the more pressing issue for the emperor's court. Remember that feeling of standing on the docks? Now, you're walking through the back streets of this fictional port city, past the dingy tenements and the market stalls. The air is thick with the sweet, sickening smell of opium smoke, not just from the dens, but from the makeshift pipes on street corners and in hidden alleyways. The British East India Company, that behemoth of a corporation, wasn't just a passive observer in this. It was the prime mover. It had a virtual monopoly on opium cultivation in British India, and it actively encouraged the trade, even when it knew the devastating effects. This wasn't just a business, it was a state-sponsored drug cartel. The company's charter was granted by the British Crown, and its profits flowed directly into the coffers of the empire. The line between corporate interest and government policy was completely blurred. In a very real sense, the British government was making a fortune by getting millions of Chinese people hooked on a debilitating substance. It was a trade triangle of tea, silver, and opium, but really, it was just an opium trade. Tea was the excuse, and silver was the measure of how successful they were at addicting a nation. This mainstream historical fact is often sanitized in textbooks, but in reality, it was a brutal, cynical business. You see a young man, barely older than a boy, slumped against a wall, his face pale and his eyes half closed in a dreamless stupor. His clothes are ragged, and a small, ceramic pipe lies on the ground beside him, a wisp of smoke still curling from its bowl. You know, you probably shouldn't, but you can't help but feel a pang of pity for him. He's just another casualty in a war fought with economics and exploitation instead of cannons and muskets. You hear a light, cynical chuckle from a European man in a fine suit who is walking past. He doesn't even spare a glance at the boy. For him, it's just the price of doing business. You can almost hear him thinking, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, or a few 100,000 lives. In this case, the British East India Company, once a small trading post, had grown into an empire within an empire. It had its own private army, its own currency, and its own laws. It controlled vast territories in India and was the instrument of British colonial expansion in Asia. The company's sole purpose was to maximize profit for its shareholders, and it did so with ruthless efficiency, even if it meant flooding a sovereign nation with an addictive drug. The opium trade was their masterstroke. It was the solution to their financial woes, the key that unlocked the wealth of China. The sheer audacity of it is what's truly staggering. Imagine a single corporation today having the power and the political will to orchestrate a similar scenario on a global scale. It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about the very real, often horrific, consequences of human greed and ambition. The poppy, a symbol of sleep and peace, became an engine of suffering and conflict, all in the name of a balanced trade sheet. As you continue your walk, you feel a sense of unease. It's not just the sight of the addicts, it's the sense of the grand, impersonal system that put them there. A system that continues to churn, powered by the misery of countless souls. The East India Company, that grand, monolithic beast of a corporation, wasn't just a simple trading outfit, it was a shadow government. An empire with its own army and its own currency, all in the service of profit. You're walking through a colonial marketplace, the air thick with the scent of spices and sweat. You see bolts of silk, stacks of fine porcelain, and chests of tea, all the things Britain craved. But you also see a different kind of commerce happening in the shadows. A more sinister one. This is where the trade triangle gets really ugly. The British would take Indian opium and sell it in China. This trade wasn't just tolerated, it was meticulously organized and heavily protected. The profits from the opium sales were used to purchase the very Chinese goods that Britain wanted, which were then sold back in Europe for even more profit. It was a perfect, self-contained system of exploitation, built on the suffering of an entire nation. The funny thing is, the Qing dynasty in China tried to stop it. They were very aware of the social and economic devastation it was causing. An imperial decree was issued forbidding the import and use of the drug. But it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a teacup. The British merchants, backed by the enormous power of the East India Company, simply ignored the edicts. There's a fascinating, almost comical, tidbit from this period: the opium smugglers. They weren't just low-level criminals, they were often British gentry. Men with fine accents and impeccable manners who saw nothing wrong with making a fortune from the addiction of others. They were the original narco barons, with top hats. They'd operate from offshore ships, bribing corrupt Chinese officials to look the other way, while their goods were ferried to shore under the cover of darkness. This kind of state-sanctioned, corporate-driven smuggling operation is a quirky, yet horrifying, example of the moral compromises made in the name of empire. And historians still argue whether the Qing government's attempts to suppress the trade were genuinely effective at all. Given the widespread corruption within their own ranks, some scholars suggest the edicts were more for show, a way to appease the public while turning a blind eye to the illegal trade that enriched many local officials. You continue your walk, the street getting narrower and darker. The main avenues are for commerce, but these side streets are where the consequences live. You see a family, a mother and her children, sitting on the ground, their possessions laid out on a grimy cloth. You can tell they've fallen on hard times. A common story in a society where a family member's addiction could bankrupt everyone. The opium trade didn't just affect the user, it ripped apart the social fabric. It created a class of impoverished addicts and their families who had no hope of escaping the cycle. The money that should have been spent on food, clothing, and education went to the dealers. It was a vicious cycle of poverty and addiction, and it was deliberately orchestrated. The East India Company's trade triangle wasn't just an economic model, it was a tool of social engineering. Designed to break a nation's will and make it subservient. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the damp air. This isn't just history, it's a brutal reality that played out on a global stage. The idea that a single corporation could be responsible for so much devastation feels almost unreal. Yet here you are, walking through the very streets where the consequences of their actions are so starkly visible. The stench of opium and despair hangs heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the price of empire. As you turn a corner, you see a small, bustling tea house, but instead of the usual quiet, dignified atmosphere, it's a chaotic scene. People are hunched over tables, not with cups of tea, but with small pipes, their faces slack and their eyes glazed over. This is a public opium den, a place where people come to escape, to forget, and to dream, but the dreams are fleeting, and the reality that awaits them on the other side is a nightmare of withdrawal and a desperate craving for the next hit. You can hear the low murmurs, the occasional cough, and the soft hiss of the drug being heated. It's a sad, quiet symphony of self-destruction, a far cry from the grand narrative of empire and commerce. This isn't just a business story, it's a human story. And it's one you are now, unfortunately, a part of. The air grows thick with a different kind of tension now. You've seen the economics and the social decay. But now you're about to witness the ultimate consequence of the opium trade: war. You find yourself standing on a waterfront. The year is 1839. This isn't just any day, this is the day that Commissioner Lin Zexu, a high-ranking Chinese official, made a stand. His mission was simple but audacious: to wipe out the opium trade in China. You watch as a massive bonfire is prepared on the beach, a symbolic pyre of defiance. The British merchants, accustomed to their impunity, are furious. They've been forced to surrender their stocks of opium, millions of pounds of the stuff, and now it's all going up in flames. You can smell the cloying, acrid odor of the burning drug, a grotesque perfume of empire's pride being challenged. This act, the destruction of all that opium at a place called Humid, is the direct trigger for what will become known as the First Opium War. It's a textbook example of a colonial power using a flimsy pretext to assert its dominance. Britain's honor had been offended, its merchants' property had been destroyed, and it was time for a show of force. The British government, under pressure from powerful merchant interests and the East India Company, declared war. Historians still argue whether the British government truly cared about the opium trade's legality or was simply looking for a justification to open up China's markets by force. It's a classic case of profit masquerading as principle. The British sent a fleet of modern warships, armed with the latest naval technology. You see them on the horizon, dark silhouettes against the gray sky, their cannons promising a very one-sided fight. The Chinese Navy, composed of outdated junks and a few antiquated war machines, was no match. This was not a war of equals, it was a military expedition of a technologically superior power against a sprawling, internally divided empire. A quirky little tidbit from this era, the Chinese military, despite its size, was technologically centuries behind. The British even had a purpose-built steam-powered warship called the HMS Nemesis, which could navigate the shallow rivers of China, something the larger, sailing-only ships could not do. It was a terrifying weapon, and its name, Nemesis, felt disturbingly appropriate. You're no longer on the beach but now in a city under siege. You can hear the distant thud of cannon fire, the screams of terror, and the frantic running of people in the streets. This is the brutal reality of a colonial war. It's not about glory, it's about subjugation. The British forces bombarded coastal cities, seizing key ports and sailing up the rivers, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The fighting was short and devastatingly effective from the British perspective. The Qing dynasty, already weakened by internal strife and the social chaos of the opium epidemic, was humiliated. In 1842, they were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, a peace accord dictated entirely by the British. You see the terms of the treaty laid out on a scroll, and they are shocking in their imbalance. China had to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 more treaty ports to foreign trade, and pay a massive indemnity to cover the cost of the destroyed opium and the war itself. It was a treaty that essentially legalized the very trade that had caused the war in the first place. You feel a sense of outrage, a sense of injustice so profound it's physically palpable. The British had not only won the war, they had made their opponent pay for the privilege of being defeated and exploited. This wasn't just a war, it was the definitive moment that opened China to Western influence and began a century of foreign control and internal turmoil. The streets you're walking on now, the ones you see filled with addicts and the destitute, are a direct result of this military and economic power play. The opium trade wasn't just a side hustle for a few merchants, it was a geopolitical tool. A weapon wielded by an imperial power to force its way into a market it couldn't otherwise penetrate. The echoes of those cannon blasts still hang in the air, a silent reminder of how a drug, a plant, and the simple desire for profit can tear a nation apart. The war is over, but the quiet devastation it wrought is just beginning to spread. You're no longer a distant observer of the docks and battlefields. You are now walking through the heart of China's social unraveling. The British have won, and the streets are a testament to their victory. The once bustling markets are now quieter, their energy drained. You see the faces of people who have lost everything, their hollow eyes staring blankly into the middle distance. The Treaty of Nanjing, remember that? It didn't just open ports, it opened the floodgates to an even greater influx of opium. With the trade now legalized, the black market dealers from Section 3 have been replaced by legitimate, or at least, legally sanctioned, British and American companies. They're no longer smuggling under the cover of night, they're operating in broad daylight. Their warehouse is now as visible and as imposing as any government building. This is a mainstream historical fact that's often glossed over, the sheer scale of the addiction. It wasn't just a few isolated individuals, it was a societal epidemic. By the late 19th century, estimates suggest there were millions of Chinese addicts, from all walks of life, from the wealthy scholar to the impoverished laborer. Opium dens, once hidden and secretive, were now a common sight in every town and city. A quirky, and rather sad, tidbit from this time is the sheer ingenuity of the common person in finding a way to get their fix. You hear stories of people selling their children into servitude, their wives into prostitution, all to get enough money for a few more puffs. The drug didn't just consume their bodies, it consumed their morality, their family bonds, and their dignity. It was a total social and personal collapse. And it was happening on a national scale. Historians still argue whether the Qing dynasty's internal corruption or the external pressure from the British was the primary cause of its decline. But it's clear the opium trade was the poison that weakened the empire from the inside out. You see the evidence of it everywhere. The civil service, once a bastion of Confucian ideals and meritocracy, was now riddled with addicts. Soldiers, meant to defend the country, were too apathetic and weak from their habit to fight effectively. The very fabric of society, built on a foundation of family, hard work, and loyalty, was being torn apart. You notice a small child, no older than 7 or 8, trying to sell a few wilted flowers on the street. Her face is smudged with dirt, and her eyes hold a wisdom and sadness far beyond her years. You know, with a sickening certainty, that she's doing this to support a parent's habit. This isn't just about a drug anymore. It's about the generational cycle of poverty and despair. You walk past a group of men sitting listlessly on a stoop. Their heads lolling, their clothes tattered. They look less like men and more like walking husks. This is the corpse-like image the title of our journey alludes to. They are a haunting presence on the streets. A quiet, mournful reminder of what happens when greed is given free rein and humanity is treated as a disposable commodity. The air is still heavy with the sickly sweet smell of the drug. But now you also detect a deeper, more profound scent. The smell of a society in decay. The bright colors of the traditional clothes seem duller. The chatter of the crowds is more subdued. And the vibrant life that once pulsed through these streets is now replaced by a kind of listless resignation. It's an almost perfect metaphor for the way the opium trade drained the life out of a nation, leaving it a shadow of its former self, waiting for a final, merciful end. Now, you're no longer in the heart of China but have been swept across the seas to a different kind of shadowland. The colonial port cities that served as the hubs for this global trade. Places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Calcutta. The air here is still thick with the smell of opium. But it's a different kind of scent. It's mingled with the salt spray of the ocean, the spices from the markets, and the unmistakable odor of desperation. You're walking through the narrow, winding streets of a place that was built on a foundation of human vice. These were not just trading posts, they were the engines of the opium machine. The British, having won their wars, used these cities as bases of operation, and the streets quickly filled with people who had come seeking their fortunes but instead found a different kind of escape. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that these port cities became magnets for a massive influx of migrants. Many of them Chinese laborers fleeing the devastation of their homeland. They arrived with hopes of finding work and a new life. But all too often, they fell prey to the same addiction that had destroyed their villages. Opium dens were not just tolerated, they were an integral part of the local economy. The colonial governments, in their infinite wisdom, often regulated and taxed the opium trade, turning a blind eye to the social cost in exchange for a steady stream of revenue. It was a win-win for the empire. They got cheap labor for their factories and docks. And they got a tax on the very substance that kept that labor compliant and under control. A quirky little tidbit from this time is the sheer variety of opium dens, which were often segregated by class. There were the squalid, filthy dens for the poor, where a few pennies could buy a few minutes of oblivion. And there were the opulent, luxurious dens for the wealthy merchants and colonial officials, who would smoke in ornate rooms with plush divans and lacquered tables, completely insulated from the human misery just a few streets away. It was a testament to how deeply the drug had seeped into every level of colonial society. The rich and powerful saw it as a decadent pastime, while the poor saw it as their only refuge from a life of backbreaking labor and abject poverty. Historians still argue whether the widespread addiction in these colonial cities was a deliberate strategy of social control or simply an unforeseen consequence of market forces. It seems like a little bit of both. The system was so perfectly designed to keep people in a state of dependency that it's hard to believe it wasn't at least partly intentional. You see the human toll everywhere. The men and women slumped in alleyways, their faces pale and their eyes vacant. They are the walking dead. The ghost of a war fought not with bullets but with a drug. You feel a pang of empathy for them, but you also feel a sense of unease. They are a mirror of a society that has lost its soul. A society that has traded its humanity for profit. You remember a similar face from the streets of China. The one with the vacant stare. And you realize that you're just seeing the same story being told in a new location. With a new cast of characters. But with the same tragic ending. The streets themselves seem to be weeping. Their cobblestones slick not with rain but with the tears of 1,000 broken dreams. The air, heavy with the sickly sweet smell of opium, feels like a physical weight on your chest. A constant reminder of the misery that built this city. Our journey takes a sharp turn. From the vast, sprawling streets of the colonial ports to the intimate, suffocating confines of an opium den in Hong Kong. This isn't the romanticized, hazy image you might have from movies. This is the real deal. You're walking down a dark, narrow alleyway, the air heavy with the sweet, sickening smell of opium smoke and something else, a deeper, more human smell of unwashed bodies and despair. You duck under a low-hanging canopy and push aside a thick, beaded curtain, and you are immediately hit by a wall of stale, humid air. Inside, it's a scene of silent, motionless suffering. The room is dimly lit by a single flickering oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Men, women, and even some young boys lie on low platforms, their heads propped up by wooden blocks. They are smoking. This is a mainstream historical fact that is often hard to comprehend. The sheer concentration of human despair in these spaces. A single den might hold dozens of people, all in various stages of a drug-induced stupor. They lie there, oblivious to the world outside, lost in their own little universe of chemically induced dreams. You hear the soft, rhythmic click of a pipe being prepared, the hiss of the opium paste being heated over a small lamp, and the long, slow inhale of a person seeking oblivion. It's a quiet, methodical process, a ritual of self-destruction. The faces you see are a mix of ages and classes. A young laborer, his hands calloused from hard work, lies beside an old scholar, his books and papers long since sold for his next hit. The drug is the great equalizer here. It reduces everyone to the same desperate state. A quirky, and very disturbing, tidbit from this time is the presence of opium assistants. These were often young, impoverished children, barely old enough to walk, who would sit with the addicts, tending the pipes for them, making sure the flame was just right and the paste was heated evenly. They were paid a pittance for this work, and they were often exposed to the fumes, setting them on a path to addiction from a very young age. It was a tragic, generational cycle, one that historians still argue whether it was a deliberate form of exploitation or simply a byproduct of a system gone horribly wrong. It was, of course, a little bit of both. The colonial government's regulation of the trade, which was meant to control it, had the unintended, or perhaps very intended, consequence of making it a viable, long-term industry. They got their tax revenue, and the industry got a steady stream of new customers. You see a man trying to stand up, his legs shaking uncontrollably. He stumbles and falls back onto the platform, his body racked with the terrible spasms of withdrawal. His friends, or what's left of them, simply ignore him. They are too lost in their own haze to notice the suffering of others. This is the human cost of the opium trade, laid bare in a single room. It's not about politics or economics anymore, it's about the sheer, unadulterated misery of a person who has lost everything: their health, their family, and their soul. The air is so thick with the smell of opium that you can feel it in your lungs. And it gives you a sense of unease, a feeling that you are being poisoned just by breathing the air. You try to imagine what it would be like to be trapped in this world. To have this one fleeting moment of peace be the only thing you have to look forward to. And you realize, with a chilling certainty, that this isn't a world of dreams at all. It's a world of quiet, suffocating death. Our journey through the grim landscapes of colonial addiction has, so far, been confined to the East. But now, the story takes a surprising twist, and you find yourself in the heart of the empire itself, Victorian London. You're walking down a fog-choked street, the gas lamps casting a sickly yellow light on the damp cobblestones. The air is heavy with the smell of coal smoke, and the constant clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage echoes in the distance. The streets are bustling with people, but if you look closely, you can see a different kind of underbelly, a hidden world that exists just beneath the surface of the grand, respectable Victorian facade. This is a mainstream historical fact that often gets forgotten in the romanticized image of London. The city had its own thriving, if small, Opium scene. While the scale was nothing compared to what was happening in China, the drug was readily available and consumed by a surprisingly diverse group of people. You might find a working-class mother using laudanum, an opium tincture, to soothe her crying baby. Or a celebrated poet using it to chase inspiration. It was a quieter, more personal form of addiction, one that was often masked by the veneer of medical respectability. Laudanum was sold openly in pharmacies and shops. A kind of Victorian-era Tylenol. A cure-all for everything from coughs and headaches to hysteria and melancholy. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of laudanum was a result of genuine therapeutic need or a societal escape from the harsh realities of industrial life. It seems like it was a bit of both. A quirky little tidbit from this time is the figure of the opium eater. The most famous of these was Thomas de Quincey, a writer who published a famous memoir about his addiction. His writings, which described the phantasmagoric visions and exquisite sensations of his opium-fueled dreams, romanticized the drug for a generation of artists and intellectuals. He made it seem less like a destructive vice and more like a muse, a shortcut to a higher plane of existence. You can almost see the shadowy figures in the back alleys, huddled over a small pipe, trying to recreate the experience de Quincey so vividly described. But you also know that for every artist who found inspiration, there were 100 others who found only ruin. You hear a light cough from a doorway and see a gaunt-faced woman huddled in a shawl, her eyes a watery shade of blue. She's not a poet, just a person trying to escape the cold, hard reality of her life. One drop of laudanum at a time. You duck into a small, nondescript building. Inside, you find a hidden opium den, a stark contrast to the ones you saw in Hong Kong. This isn't a communal space, it's a series of small, private rooms, separated by thin curtains. The air is less thick with the drug, but the smell is still there. A constant, cloying presence. You see a man in a rumpled suit, his face pale and his eyes glazed over, meticulously preparing his pipe. He is an addict, but he is also a respectable member of society. Or at least he tries to be. This is the difference between the opium trade in the East and the opium use in the West. In the colonies, it was a social epidemic that destroyed a nation. In London, it was a quiet, private tragedy, a skeleton in the closet of a society that was desperately trying to project an image of moral rectitude and imperial power. The opium from China had completed its journey, not just as a commodity, but as a silent, invisible poison, seeping into the very heart of the empire that had unleashed it on the world. You shiver, but not from the cold. You're standing in a Victorian-era apothecary, a place filled with jars of strange powders, dried herbs, and tinctures of every color. The air smells of camphor and alcohol. On the shelves, among the bottles of cough syrup and headache powders, you see a small, unassuming bottle with a label that reads, laudanum. This is the medical paradox of opium, a substance that was, at once, a cure and a curse. For centuries, opium was considered a miracle drug. It was an effective painkiller, a potent sedative, and a cough suppressant. It was used to treat everything from dysentery and cholera to insomnia and depression. Its power to numb both physical and emotional pain made it an indispensable tool in the doctor's bag, especially in an era before modern anesthesia and pharmaceuticals. This is a mainstream historical fact that can feel counterintuitive today, when we think of opium as a dangerous street drug. But for most of human history, it was a respected and widely used medicine. In fact, a quirky little tidbit from this time is that many Victorian doctors and pharmacists saw the widespread use of laudanum as a sign of progress, a way to alleviate the suffering of the masses. They genuinely believed they were doing good, even as they were unknowingly creating a generation of addicts. The line between medicinal use and recreational abuse was incredibly blurry, and it was often a matter of dosage and intent. Historians still argue whether the medical community of the era was truly ignorant of opium's addictive properties or if they simply chose to ignore the long-term consequences in favor of the short-term relief it provided. It's a debate that highlights the ethical complexities of medicine. While doctors knew opium could create dependency, they often saw the addiction itself as a personal failing on the part of the patient, a lack of moral fiber rather than a physiological condition. You hear a sharp cough from a woman holding a small child. She asks the apothecary for a bottle of laudanum, not for herself, but for her sick child. The apothecary, a man with a kind face and gentle hands, sells it to her without a moment of hesitation. He genuinely believes he is helping her. You, with the benefit of a century of hindsight, know he is handing her a bottle of pain and suffering. You also know that she will likely give it to her child. And the cycle will continue. The medical paradox of opium is a powerful reminder that history is not just about heroes and villains. It's about people making decisions in a world of limited information and imperfect knowledge. The same drug that could soothe the pain of a terminal illness could also condemn a person to a life of misery. The same doctors who were revered for their knowledge were also, in a way, complicit in a global drug epidemic. You see a man with a bandage wrapped around his leg, wincing in pain as he waits for his turn at the counter. The apothecary hands him a small bottle, and you know, with a sinking feeling, that the pain will be gone. But a new, more terrible kind of pain is just beginning. This quiet, respectable exchange in a sterile shop is just as much a part of the opium story as the chaotic, sprawling dens of Hong Kong. It's a reminder that the drug's journey was not just geographical, it was also a journey from the realm of medicine to the realm of addiction. A transition that was made possible by the very people who were sworn to heal. You've seen the ships, the docks, the dens, and the apothecaries, but who were the men at the center of it all? Now you're in a grand, oak-paneled office in the heart of London, a roaring fire in the hearth. The air here doesn't smell of opium smoke, but of fine cigars and aged whiskey. Across from you sits a man with a handlebar mustache and an expensive suit. This is the complex figure of the opium merchant. He's not a back-alley drug dealer, he's a pillar of society. He's a director of the East India Company, a member of parliament, a generous philanthropist who donates money to orphanages and builds hospitals. He's a man who, in his own mind, is doing a great service for his country and his shareholders. This is a mainstream historical fact that is hard to reconcile. The architects of the opium trade were often the very people who were the most respected and admired in British society. They were celebrated as captains of industry, as men who had built the empire through their ingenuity and hard work. They saw themselves not as purveyors of addiction, but as agents of commerce, opening up new markets and bringing civilization to the lesser nations. A quirky little tidbit is that some of these merchants, like William Jardine and James Matheson, were known for their lavish lifestyles and were even granted peerages and knighthoods. Their immense fortunes built on a foundation of human suffering. They were the original robber barons, but with a distinctly British flavor. Historians still argue whether these men were truly apathetic to the human cost of their trade or if they simply compartmentalized their morality, viewing the social destruction in China as an unfortunate but necessary side effect of a profitable business. It seems clear they didn't see themselves as villains. They saw the addicts as weak-willed, and the Chinese government as stubborn and backward for resisting a trade that was inevitable. You can almost hear one of them say it now, with a gentle, self-satisfied chuckle. One can't be too squeamish in the pursuit of progress. Old boy, this is the chilling reality of it all, the casual disregard for human life. The ability to rationalize the most heinous of acts for the sake of profit. They were not evil monsters, they were just men. Ambitious, greedy, and utterly blind to the suffering they caused. You stand and walk to a large map on the wall, one that charts the global trade routes. You see the lines of commerce stretching from London to Calcutta to Canton. A web of red ink that connects continents and cultures. But you, with the benefit of your journey, see another map, one drawn in blood and tears. You see the silent, suffering faces of the addicts, the grieving families, and the ruined cities. You realize that the grandeur of this office, the fine mahogany desk, the expensive cigars, all of it is built on a foundation of human misery. This is the final, most unsettling part of the story. The victims of the opium trade weren't just the addicts in the dens of Hong Kong. They were also the men in this very room. Men who had sold their souls for a fortune and didn't even know it. You feel a sense of unease, a feeling that you are a ghost haunting this place. A silent witness to a history that is far more complex and morally ambiguous than a simple story of good versus evil. The story of opium isn't just about supply and demand, or wars and profit, it's also a story of resistance. Our journey now takes us to the rise of anti-opium movements. You're in a packed lecture hall in London. A place where people are finally beginning to talk about the human cost of the trade. The speaker, a man with a stern face and a passionate voice, is railing against the British government and the East India Company, calling them out for their role in the mass addiction of the Chinese people. This isn't a single person's crusade, it's a social movement. From the late 19th century onward, a growing number of individuals and organizations, from missionaries and doctors to humanitarians and politicians, began to speak out against the trade. They saw the moral hypocrisy of an empire that preached Christian values while profiting from the misery of others. This is a mainstream historical fact that marked a turning point in the opium narrative. The public conscience of Britain and other Western nations was beginning to be pricked. The stories of suffering from the colonial ports and China were slowly making their way back home, thanks to the tireless work of missionaries and journalists. A quirky tidbit from this era is the creation of anti-opium cartoons and propaganda posters, which depicted the drug as a serpent or a monster, and the Chinese people as its helpless victims. These images were often sensationalist and sometimes even racist, but they were effective in mobilizing public opinion against the trade. You see a black and white print of a monstrous poppy flower, its petals dripping with blood, and a tiny, cowering figure of a Chinese man at its base. It's an effective piece of propaganda, even if it's a little over the top. Historians still argue whether these movements were truly driven by humanitarian concerns or were simply a new form of imperial control, a way to justify the colonization of the uncivilized nations by claiming to save them from their own vices. It was, as usual, a mix of both. Many of the people involved in the anti-opium movement were genuine humanitarians, but their work was also used by politicians and colonial administrators to further their own agendas. The British government, under increasing pressure, began to reluctantly shift its policies. They couldn't ignore the moral outrage forever. You feel the weight of this public pressure, the slow but steady turning of the tide. The opium merchants, once so untouchable, were now being publicly shamed. Their names were being tarnished, their reputations questioned. The very wealth that had once given them power was now a source of public scorn. The anti-opium movement eventually led to a series of international conferences, beginning with the Shanghai Opium Commission in 1909. These were the first tentative steps toward global drug control. The meetings were awkward and tense, with the British government still trying to defend its position. But the writing was on the wall. The world was changing. The old ways of doing business, of profiting from human misery, were no longer acceptable. The streets you're walking on now, in London, feel a little cleaner, a little safer, because of the efforts of these reformers. But you also know that the fight is far from over. The global drug trade is a hydra, and cutting off one head only makes two more grow in its place. The story of opium is a lesson in the power of public opinion, a slow, grinding force that can, eventually, change the course of history. The winds of change are blowing, but they are not a gale, they are a slow, steady breeze. You're now in the early 20th century, and you can feel the shift in imperial policies. The public pressure from the anti-opium movements, combined with a growing understanding of addiction as a medical condition, is finally forcing the British government's hand. This is a mainstream historical fact. In 1907, Britain and China signed an agreement to gradually reduce the opium trade over a 10-year period. It was a landmark moment, a tacit admission that the trade was morally indefensible. The British government agreed to decrease its opium exports to China, and the Chinese government promised to eradicate domestic opium production. It sounds like a happy ending, but of course, it wasn't that simple. A quirky little tidbit from this time is that many of the old opium merchants were incredibly resistant to the change. They saw the government's newfound morality as a betrayal. They had made their fortunes and built their reputations on this trade, and now they were being asked to give it all up. You can almost hear their indignant protests. But we've been doing this for a century. It's a matter of free trade. They had a point. In a twisted, capitalist sort of way, the very system that had made them rich was now being dismantled by the same government that had protected and encouraged it. Historians still argue whether this shift in policy was a genuine moral awakening or a pragmatic decision to save face in a changing world. It was probably a mix of both. The British government realized that their imperial ambitions could no longer be built on the back of a drug trade that was destroying nations. The quest for control was also driven by economic factors. The British were no longer a single, monolithic empire. They had rivals, particularly the United States and Germany, who were beginning to see the strategic value of a strong, stable China. A country in the throes of a drug epidemic was not a good trading partner. It was an unstable market, and a geopolitical liability. So, the opium trade, once the engine of empire, was now seen as a liability, a stain on the moral character of the British Empire. You see the signs of this change everywhere. The old opium dens are being shut down, replaced by clinics for addicts. The once ubiquitous sight of the opium addict is becoming less common, replaced by a sense of hope, however faint. But the story isn't over. The end of the official, government-sanctioned opium trade didn't end the drug's grip on the world. It simply pushed the trade back into the shadows. The illegal trade, the one that had been lurking in the background for a century, now exploded. The opium that was no longer being shipped from India was now being grown in the mountains of China, in Burma, and in other parts of Asia. The streets you're walking on are no longer filled with the quiet, resigned despair of the opium addict, but with a new kind of fear. The fear of the criminal underworld that now controls the trade. You shiver, but not from the cold. The story of opium, it turns out, is a bit like a ghost. Even when you think it's gone, it's still lurking in the shadows, waiting to make its presence known again. The opium story, as you've seen, isn't just about politics and economics. It's also a deeply cultural one. You're walking through the halls of a museum, and you can see the cultural footprint of opium everywhere. It's in the art, the literature, and the music of the era. This is a mainstream historical fact that shows how deeply the drug had seeped into the collective consciousness of both East and West. In the West, particularly in Victorian England, opium became a symbol of a kind of exotic, forbidden decadence. It was a subject for writers and poets who were fascinated by its power to create vivid, dreamlike states. A quirky, and rather sad, tidbit from this era is the sheer number of famous artists and writers who were addicted to the drug. From Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whose famous poem, Kubla Khan, was said to be inspired by an opium-fueled dream, to the painter Jean-François Millet, who used opium to cope with a chronic illness. The drug became a part of the creative process for many. They saw it as a shortcut to the sublime, a way to unlock the doors of perception. But for every masterpiece that was created, there were countless works of art and literature that were never finished. Countless lives that were destroyed. Historians still argue whether the drug truly enhanced creativity or simply provided a temporary escape that led to artistic and personal ruin. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Did the drug make them great? Or were they great artists who just happened to be addicts? You walk past a glass case containing a small, ornate opium pipe, a beautiful object with intricate carvings and a dark, sinister presence. It looks less like a tool of destruction and more like a work of art. That's the insidious thing about it all. The drug was often romanticized, even in its most destructive form. You see a painting of a beautiful, pale woman in a luxurious opium den, her eyes half closed in a state of tranquil ecstasy. The painting is beautiful, but you know, with the cold clarity of your journey, that the reality was far more grim. The woman in the painting is likely an addict, her life slowly being consumed by a drug that promises a dream but delivers a nightmare. The opium narrative in literature was equally complex. From the works of Arthur Conan Doyle, where Sherlock Holmes uses opium to help him think, to the more cautionary tales of writers who saw the drug's destructive power. The literary world grappled with the drug's moral and social implications. The streets of Victorian London you visited, remember those? They were often the setting for these stories. The fog-choked alleyways and the shadowy figures providing the perfect backdrop for a tale of addiction and despair. The cultural footprint of opium is a reminder that the drug's influence went far beyond the streets of the colonial ports. It seeped into the very soul of the societies that consumed it. It was a story told in poems, paintings, and novels, a story that was both a romanticized escape and a tragic warning. We've traced the journey of opium from the poppy fields of India to the streets of Victorian London. But our journey isn't quite over. We need to look at the long shadow of addiction in the modern world. You're back in the present day, walking through a bustling, modern metropolis. The skyscrapers cast long shadows on the streets. and the air is filled with the scent of car exhaust and fast food. The world is a very different place. But the ghosts of the past are still here. The opium trade, as it existed in the 19th century, is gone, but its legacy is all around us. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Opium Wars and the subsequent treaties laid the groundwork for the modern global drug trade. The trade, once controlled by governments and corporations, is now controlled by cartels and organized crime syndicates. The drugs have changed. We're no longer talking about simple opium paste, but about heroin, fentanyl, and other potent opioids. But the story is the same: a powerful, addictive substance that rips apart families, destroys communities, and fuels a black market that operates outside the law. A quirky little tidbit is that the very same regions that were once hubs for the colonial opium trade, the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia and the Golden Crescent of Afghanistan and Pakistan, are now the primary producers of the world's illegal opium and heroin. It's a haunting echo of the past, a reminder that some wounds never truly heal. Historians still argue whether the historical opium trade was a unique event in the history of globalization or a blueprint for future forms of exploitation. It seems to have been both. It was a unique event in its scale and in the overt complicity of a major world power. But it also provided a model for how a powerful nation could use economic and military force to impose its will on a weaker one. A model that has been repeated throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. You see a news report on a screen in a storefront window. A story about a modern drug epidemic. The faces of the addicts are different. The clothes they wear are different. But the pain in their eyes is the same. The hopelessness, the desperation, the quiet surrender to a substance that promises a fleeting escape and delivers a long, slow death. You realize that the streets you were walking on in the past are the same streets you're walking on now, just with a different coat of paint. The ghost of the opium addict is still here, a quiet, mournful presence on the streets of a world that has, in many ways, forgotten its own history. The long shadow of addiction is not just a historical footnote. It's a modern crisis, a global problem that affects every country on Earth. The stories you've heard, the people you've seen, are not just from a long-lost past. They are a reflection of a present-day reality. A reminder that the forces of greed and exploitation are still at work. And that the quiet, insidious power of a drug can still bring a nation to its knees. The streets of opium corpses. It turns out, we're not just in Victorian colonies, they are everywhere. Our journey is almost at an end. You've walked the streets of empires, from the bustling ports of the Victorian colonies to the hidden dens of London. And you've seen the human cost of a trade built on a single, insidious drug. You've heard the stories of the rich and powerful who profited from it and the desperate and destitute who were consumed by it. Now, as the final chapter of our story unfolds, it's time to ease out of this historical fog and into the calm, quiet space of your own bedroom. Let the images of the streets and the faces of the addicts begin to fade. The smell of the opium and the coal smoke is dissipating, replaced by the familiar scents of your own home. The sounds of the distant cannon fire and the whispers of the dying are gone, replaced by the gentle hum of your fan and the soft rhythm of your own breathing. The story we've explored is a dark one, filled with greed, exploitation, and suffering, but it's also a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is a flicker of hope. The anti-opium movements, the doctors who fought to understand addiction, and the voices that cried out against injustice all remind us that history is not a static, predetermined thing. It is shaped by the choices of countless individuals, both for good and for ill. The ghosts of the past are still with us, but they are not just ghosts of suffering, they are also ghosts of resilience, of resistance, and of hope. You're no longer a ghostly presence on the streets of a long-lost past. You are here, in your own bed, safe and sound. The history we've just journeyed through is a reminder that the world we live in today is built on the foundations of the past. And that understanding where we came from is the only way to truly understand where we are going. Let the images from our journey fade away, one by one. The grand ships on the docks, the solemn face of the Chinese commissioner, the gaunt faces in the opium dens, the respectable gentleman in his London office. They are all gone, receding into the mists of time. Now, as your eyelids feel heavy and your body feels relaxed, take a deep, slow breath. The story is over. The journey is complete. Let yourself drift away. From the complexities of history to the simple, peaceful state of sleep, all the details, all the facts, all the faces, can be put away now. Your mind is a calm, quiet room, and the door is being gently closed. The history is done. All that's left is the stillness of the night and the soft peace of a well-deserved rest. Sweet dreams.